So the watch has been released, we know what it looks like, and the question we have to ask is, could it be improved? I've got a secret to tell you. A design can always be improved. This video is going to be broken up into 3 parts. Part 1, looking at the new watch briefly. Part 2, the significance of the Marine Nationale partnership and the history with Tudor. And Part 3, if I was given the brief, with a couple of mood boards and a few developments along the way, how would I have tackled the Marine Nationale partnership? The countdown began on the 9th of November, we had a day to wait, and as of now, this is what the watch looks like. Bearing in mind that this recording is happening a day before the release, so he has no idea what the watch actually looks like. Please be a Pelagos. Please be a Pelagos. Please be a... Now, the French Navy is no stranger to watches. Surprise, surprise, Tudor is not the only company to have any involvement with the Marine Nationale. And here are a few names: Hanhart, Breguet, Longines, Oracoste, Aran, Dodin, Vixer, Mattei Tissot, Doxer, Triton, ZRC, J. Bianchi, Yema. Oh, and Blancpain, Rolex, Omega, and Tudor. We could say they're the most experienced navy, the ones that have received the most amount of watches to test prototypes for the last 50 years. The significance, then, of the Marine Nationale partnership. We saw this relationship begin very early on with Blancpain and how the development of the Aqualung and the 50 Fathoms took hold. But with Tudor, we saw an incremental development from the 50s all the way up until the 80s. And over this period of time, a development of a handful of models that are quite significant. First, the Big Crown, the reference 7924. Second, the Submariner, the 7928. And most importantly, we could say the Snowflake, the 7016 and the 9411. But what makes this issuance of divers so impactful is that they weren't just supplied to the French, they were supplied all over the world. To Canada, a very unique submariner that we could say influenced the development of the Black Bay line. To parts of the world like Australia, South Africa, Argentina, and to North America, where submariners were adopted by the Navy. I've said this a few times now, but the Tudor Submariner, the Tudor Snowflake, is one of the most successful divers of all time because of just how versatile it was, how many places it visited in its lifetime. It's the versatility behind its design, it's the accessibility, the use of a simple ETA movement that made it so applicable. They were extremely affordable, and the best part was that they were taken directly off the shelves and sent to the Navy. They weren't manipulated or altered in any way. The majority of these watches were packaged and sold directly. Looking at this new design of the watch, why is the Pelagos such a perfect choice? It's one watch that is directly linked to Tudor's identity now. It's pulling inspiration from the Snowflake Submariner. Of course, now they can't use the Submariner name because Rolex owns it, and a watch like this would take the attention away from the big brother. The Pelagos design and all its components belong to Tudor, which is why it's a brilliant choice. It's a perfect example of a dive watch, especially when it's given these military specifications. Seeing this watch in the hands of the Navy again is amazing, and I think giving it the credit is important, because the simple Snowflake design is so excellent for its purpose. But let's just say for fun, no regimented design, nothing too linear. I was given the brief to come up with this watch and handed a few bits and pieces of information that would help build on this idea. How would an enthusiast who greatly appreciates the design of the MilSub, of the Snowflake, of its development, of the Marine Nationale history, how could we improve on this final design, make it look even better, especially calling back to those historic nuances that made the Tudor Snowflake so iconic, as well as trying to find something a bit more modern, making it more versatile in today's sense. The 2 core watches that I looked into for this inspiration, the Rolex MilSub, reference 5513-1417, and the Tudor Submariner, reference 9411. Using the Pelagos as a base plate is an excellent idea, so that stays. The watch is released in black. The size goes from 42mm down to 40. The case is made of titanium and adopts the skin diver elements that define this new direction. The bezel, one of the most excellent options, stays graduated and with a reverse countdown timer. With this example, the central pip on the bezel has been removed. Why are these markers significant? Well, it does call back to those MilSubs, adds a bit more of a reference for a mil-spec piece. It helps to differentiate it away from the standard models that we see so often. It also aids in legibility and using the bezel for time telling. It might be a bit overemphasized, but the function is there, and that's the most important detail. I would also expect it to be fully loomed. The dial keeps its stepping. This is something of a modern direction that I think makes the Pelagos a lot more interesting. Gives it some visuality, some more three-dimensionality that I think is important. And one of the big changes, the date moves from the 3 o'clock position to the 4. What makes the Snowflake dial so excellent is that the squared forms allow for you to keep the date hidden, relatively hidden. Which means then you can have a visual no-date looking watch. It keeps the date in a position that is not easily noticed, and it's only really there when you need it. And I also enlarge the crown and the crown guards a little bit more. But then to the details, this is where the ultra nerd steps in. This is when you get so clued up on the details that it gets a little bit sickening. The Tudor rose replaces the shield. This is not timeline correct, but looking to the inspiration of the 7928 Submariner, one of the first models that really made a name for itself, especially with the US Navy. It was such an interesting touch. I was also really close to adding the smiling self-winding at the base of the dial, but it did look a bit cluttered, so I decided to leave it in favor of a bit more symmetry. The word Geneva is replaced under the Tudor name with chronometer. Since you can find Swiss made at the bottom of the dial, you don't need to have the name repeated twice. And what it then allows you to do is prove the chronometer certification underneath the logo of the watch. It's a little bit cleaner. Then referring to the Rolex MilSub, a circle L for Luminova instead of a circle T for tritium. This is something that calls back to those 70s design elements. Underneath that, a very fine line for the depth rating, and directly underneath that, the Pelagos name. So between these two components, you have essentially 2 lines of text and a logo of some kind. And there is great congruence between these parts if you squint your eyes and look at the elements. The roundness of the Tudor rose matching the roundness of the circle L. The size of the Pelagos name capping off the description of the watch. Where Tudor is the first line of text, Pelagos is below. So the scale of the text is emphasized in such a way that it feels natural to the eye. And if this watch was ever presented, it would be on a black NATO strap. And the whole idea behind this design was to simplify it down, make it a bit more digestible, easy to read, a bit more visually appealing to the eye. And I know it goes against a lot of what Tudor's identity is now, but I have this feeling that this is how the enthusiast might approach it, especially one who loves the nuances of design and what made Tudor what it was, wants to keep it modern but also have some vintage ties. Yes, we could say this is quite a literal approach of how a MilSub would be put together. And where this new example seems to shine is because it's choosing function over fashion. It is getting rid of a lot of the superfluous for the sake of function. Where my different direction tries to blend a bit of both. A few more details that would captivate the enthusiast, as well as adding some things that are pretty important for the modern watch today. At the same time being able to hammer home that this is a military piece through and through. Fun exercise. I'm so happy to see that this watch exists, that all the news and rumors were true, and this watch is finally out for us to enjoy. The future is bright for this partnership, and I think it was handled extremely well. This is by far one of the most significant releases, launches, and watches that Tudor has ever brought out, and for that reason I think it's important. It's historically important, it shows its influences, wears its heart on its sleeve, and for us enthusiasts, it's a great watch. This is coming to you from the editing desk now that the video is finished. Of course, since this video was recorded a day before the time, I couldn't see the watch to talk about it in any more detail. So a quick criticism around it and some of the elements that have divided a few opinions. The watch is still 42mm, it's got a titanium case, so it means then it's going to be lightweight, its size is going to be pretty good. The thickness has been brought down. The watch measures around 12.5mm, so that's a slight improvement. The downside of this model, which I think is going to be a cause of concern, is that the lug length is 52mm, which means it's going to wear pretty large on the wrist. And to think with the use of a skin diver case, it would give you the ability of being able to bring the lug-to-lug length down, increase the diameter of the watch and its dial, but then leave the lugs slightly smaller, similar with turtle cases from makers like Seiko. But looking to the details, like the full engraving on the case back and the bidirectional bezel, it definitely does come across as an instrument. Another great thing to see is they've added a more serrated edge to the bezel teeth. But with all of these great qualities, it also loses a lot of things. The helium escape valve, the ability of being able to attach a bracelet to the watch. So there are pros and cons. Do these pros outweigh the cons? Well, you are getting a watch that's a bit more horologically significant. It is a much cleaner design, it's a lot more function focused. But with all of that simplicity and sterility it offers, it might also be too basic for some. Got a question to ask you. Wouldn't it suck if this release wasn't a Pelagos. I've just spent the last like 20 minutes doing a recording about a watch that doesn't exist. So what is the significance? So what is with the significance? But what makes this issuance of divers so impactful is that they weren't just supplied to the French. They were supplied all over the world. To Canada.